Um, Section 6 is extremely key, this section that we've entitled In Search of Connection, because it's about, it's a unique way of looking at the Quran in general and the Fatiha specifically. This is just a bit of background. There's a science inside the science of the Quran. So in Ulum al-Quran, we have something called Ilm al-Munasabat or Ilm al-Munasaba, which is the science of the internal correspondence and coherence between the verses of the Quran. And it's a very unique and an interesting way of looking at the Quran. Imam Al-Suyuti radiallahu anh, Jalaluddin Al-Suyuti from the 10th century, he actually says that the truest and the deepest miracle of the Quran is this internal coherence between the verses. And I mentioned Imam Al-Ghazali radiallahu anh, he said that he says that when the beginner, you see, as a beginning non-scholarly, non-deep reader, when you look at the Quran, it all apparently seems quite disordered and disorganized and unattached and incoherent. It doesn't seem to be attached or connected to each other. So for example, we read the Fatiha and suddenly we move on to Alif Lam Mim, and suddenly Dhalik al-Kitab, and then we're speaking about the nations of the past, and then from there we're talking about divorce, and from there the rules of prayer. So there doesn't seem to be any thematic alliance or coalescence between the verses. But what the scholars say is that the more time you spend with the Quran and the more deeper you look at the Quran and study the Quran, what you notice is that the verses begin to sink in. Everything's in complete synchrony and everything begins to coalesce and come together as an entire wholesome unit. And this is one of the rare arts of reading the Quran. It's an extremely rare and unique way of reading the Quran, and this is it's matchless. This idea or this manner of reciting the Quran cannot be found in any other scripture. And if the Quran, what Imam Al-Ghazali says was that if any other book was to be apparently structured like the Quran, so for example, if you look at the end of Surah Israel, for example, Bani Israel, the way that surah ends and the way the next surah starts, there doesn't seem to be any relevance. And if you were to write any novel like that, if you write a book where one chapter ends and another one starts from somewhere else and it doesn't seem to continue on from the previous chapter, we would deem that a bad piece of writing. Literally speaking and from linguistic perspective, that would be considered a bad piece of writing. But with the Quran, it's not the case. With the Quran, its outward discrepancies and its outward incoherence, it doesn't put people off reading the scripture. And the more time you spend with it, the more you realize that it's actually very deeply, very well connected. It all synchronizes into one entity, and such that Imam Fakhruddin Razi radiallahu anh, he used to say in his Mafatih al-Ghaib, he said that iqra'ul Qur'ana ka'ayatin wahida. He said you can recite the whole Quran as though it's a single verse. The whole Quran is so deeply connected and so intermittently tied that you can read it, the whole thing, as a single verse. That's how deeply connected it is. So, and Imam Al-Ghazali, he says it's like the amateur astronomer or the amateur sky watcher, where he said that when as an amateur, as a beginner, novice sky watcher, when you start looking at the night sky, what you notice is the stars, but they don't seem to be in any particular order. They're very incoherent, very ad hoc, haphazardly placed, hodgepodge, just blotches of light without any organization. And then he says that if you spend more time with the Quran, with the night sky, if the novice, as he grows and he becomes an amateur and then he begins to master the night sky and he looks more deeply, he begins to notice patterns, and those patterns we call constellations now. So there's a manner in which you can deal with the Quran which is exactly the same. The Quran, the verses of the Quran are like ad hoc, unorganized, incoherent stars in the sky. And the more time the reader spends with the Quran and the more attention one pays and the more deeper one delves, then what you begin to see is that there's a deep connection and coherence inside all the verses.